So, what you can expect from today's episode. You can expect to know how Joe started his journey as a serial entrepreneur and as a Christian, how his faith has informed his business decisions, why he's passionate about Christian entrepreneurship in particular, and the lessons that he learned along the way that can be applied to your journey. Welcome, everyone, back to another episode of Kingdom Commerce. I am your host, Cooper Peterson, joined by executive producer Joe Abraham. Joe, we're really excited to have you on the show today.
Yeah, it's good to be on.
So, as you all know, Joe has been on the show quite a bit, and we thought it would be a good idea to get a little bit more background information on Joe so you guys know a little bit about who he is and what he's done. We've talked about him being a serial entrepreneur, but we want to dive in today into his businesses and the lessons he's learned from them. So as we begin, Joe, I just want to start off saying thanks again for being on the show.
Yeah.
And what would you say was, as we dive into your story, when did your entrepreneurial journey start? Were you entrepreneurial as a child, or did this all kind of happen spontaneously? How did it all start?
It was very spontaneous. Like, no one watching me growing up would say that, oh, this kid's a future entrepreneur, other than the fact that I wasn't a very good student, right? So they do say that like the best entrepreneurs weren't the best students. But,
Interesting.
that's neither here nor there. No, for me, I had already was just finishing up college. I'd gotten my first job. It was just a regular job at a consulting firm, being like a helper to the owner, operator of the business. And a friend of mine who was doing really well in a business of his own said, hey, doing really well. I can set you up. You could make some money. You can even do it as a side hustle. But, I'm making 5 times what you're making at your job. And I was like, oh man, like this guy's a year and a half older than me. And at that time, I was just hungry to make money, student loans, this, that, the other. And so that's what kind of activated that, oh, I got to try it. I want to build something. I want to be part of owning something rather than showing up and sitting at a desk every day.
Yeah, so I'm curious. You stated before that you were a biology major, correct?
Mm-hmm.
At the time. So yeah, I,
Mm-hmm.
I I was kind of on the similar path. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Did you think your biology major prepared you at all for entrepreneurship?
College did, but not nothing specific to what I was, the coursework I was taking. But yeah, the college experience for sure, because it brought me out of my shell. It got me talking to people. It got me building relationships. It certainly started building my network because I was part of a fraternity. So I knew I could call on people, not just at my school, but across the country. So those things were beneficial, but that was about
Yeah,
it.
yeah. As I look back, I completed my environmental science degree, and I'm trying to be optimistic in in how I
You won't
was
be
able
putting it
to.
to use much, no.
I think like the general like writing and critical thinking skills I think were important,
Yeah,
but
that's all good.
um anyway, so now it's like now that I've switched, it's like wow, like learning a lot of new content all at once.
Yeah.
Um so at this time were you a Christian when you like when you're in this
Yeah.
college time?
Yeah. All through college. Yeah. Because I was saved when I was 7 because I was a preacher's kid. Um, but yeah, during my college days, I was active in the church. Like we went to church, we were part of like the college ministry stuff, but it wasn't the thing for me. I was just checking the box to do my part, that kind of stuff.
Okay. So let's dive in. So you said you were approached by somebody who's like I'm making 5 times as more as you and there's an opportunity for you. So you just all of a sudden just spontaneously switched and decided to start what business, what was it, and who was it with? I mean, generally
Yeah, so
speaking.
this was the mid '90s, right? 1996-ish, when the wellness boom was just starting. It's like nutritional supplements, fitness. It was like just becoming the thing. So he was in that space, like it was nutritional supplement distribution, getting it, from the wholesaler, getting it to retailers, or in some cases going direct to end users, because you couldn't walk into a Walmart and get like vitamin C back then, or like
Wow.
uh, the stuff you see there now. So yeah, that was what it was, and I knew nothing about it. I just knew, okay, if I buy a certain amount and sell it, or I get, you know, distribution going, I make X. And so it wasn't because of a passion I had for wellness or anything. It was just, I just wanted to get out of having to work a job for the rest of my life. So that was the motivation for me.
So let's keep going along this process. So you start this business with a friend, and how did this business um how were you able to apply like your faith, or did you apply your faith to this first business?
I think in the first business, it wasn't a very active pursuit of it. I mean, I called it Cornerstone International, right? So like my faith was kind of there, and I wanted to name it after the Cornerstone. But day to day, in my day to day decisions of what we were going to do and what decisions were going to be made and all that, I don't recall that being Christ being kind of the center of all that. I was just hustling to make money and get a business going and all that. Now, by default, I was drawn to other Christians. God put a couple Christians in my life. Like later in the business, maybe 6, 7 years later, I brought a partner in, and he was a strong believer. So in that sense, because of going to church world and being connected in that network, by default that happened. But I
Interesting.
would not say those were my days of like building a Christ honoring business. But it wasn't
Okay.
bad either. It was kind of
Right.
in the middle.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, it's just like sort of that lukewarm, but like you still have that
Yeah.
like cultural Christianity roots. So when I'm assuming many of our audience, either they're young entrepreneurs in the sense that they're just starting out their business or they're thinking about it, or maybe perhaps they're young as in like college. What did this for you? What did this first college business experience do for you in terms of help you in your quote unquote education in preparing you for your next businesses? And what were some of the lessons that you learned that you think that you could pass on to some of our audience today as what they can do to prepare?
My first business, as I think for you too, Cooper, and I think for most entrepreneurs in their first one, the big lesson was the skill building, right? How to talk to people, how to sell, especially when you're like 20 something and you're talking to people who are in their 40s who've been doing business for 15, 20 years, buying, selling, whatever, right? Bankers, this, that, the other. Just the language of business, learning how to talk, overcome objections, deal with rejection of people saying no. Those were kind of the big skills that got built in that first business. And I didn't make a lot of money. Like my first couple of years, I think I was upside down, right? Like I was spending more than I was making. But the lessons I learned and the education I got those first 2 years when I was broke, like we had to have like a suit to wear, to these some of these
Right.
business meetings. Like I couldn't
Yeah.
even afford that. Like, but yeah, that was like a PhD those first 2 years. And fortunately, there were mentors involved and people who were more successful in that business who were willing to help and guide and coach, and that made a huge difference.
Yeah. Something I've been noticing just recently, and people have been saying this quite a bit, but when you see successful business people, and what for whatever reason their venture fails, and they either go into debt or they go to zero, but then they're able to come back and create a
Yeah,
successful business after that, because of the skill sets that they already understand and know. And that's kind of my thought process in starting a business and a small business in college. I did it sort of like you in a spontaneous way. I didn't really know what I was doing, but to me, the education aspect of it has been more valuable than the monetary
yeah,
aspect of it. And so
yeah.
that was, yeah, I totally relate to that. So you had this first business in college. What happened to it? Because you're a serial entrepreneur. You've started five businesses in total.
Yeah, this is the fifth one I'm on now. Yeah, so that business, it started in 96. And many years later, I brought in a partner, like I mentioned. And then a couple years after that, he brought in another partner and they bought me out because I was off to my next thing, right? So that business still exists. Now my
Wow.
partners pivoted it into other different things. But man, yeah, like that first one is 20 plus years later is still
Wow.
around technically, which is pretty exciting. But yeah,
Yeah,
my
that's
journey
awesome.
there with that business was 8 years.
Okay, cool. And then so you decided what was your mindset? You just kind of decided you had another interest, or you found something,
I
another
just,
problem that you wanted to solve, and you just kind of moved on. That was bigger and better.
I just got bored. Yeah, like, in the classic entrepreneurial setting, like I've found now, looking back, I'm the guy who gets it off the ground and gets it to a certain point. I'm not the guy who likes to operate it 10 years later.
Okay.
So once it was up and running and all the excitement of like the hustle, and man, are we going to make payroll this week? Are we going to make it through? Once all that was gone and it became more about incremental growth or whatever, I was like, so yeah, my mentor, actually, the one who had helped us become successful in the first one, um, invited me to help him start his next company because he had been kind of coaching me along. She's like, look, I trust you. I want you to be the president of my next business. And it happened to be completely unrelated. The first business was product distribution and wellness. This one was digital, the early days of digital marketing on the web.
Interesting. So what? So your business partner, your mentor, he just gained so much trust in what you were able to do for the earlier company, and so he's like, I want to make you president. How old were you at this point?
27, 28.
27, 28.
Yeah. And so this was a technology startup back in what was called the original .com boom. So
Okay.
yeah, I was a young guy. Like my CTO who reported to me was like 48 years old.
Wow,
So
that's
it
great.
was a strange and weird world, but yeah, that's how it worked out. Yeah.
And how did your faith play into your decisions in this business? Were you more submitted to the Lord at this time? How did your faith impact this business?
No, this business was an opportunity for God to allow me, which He does. He allowed me to kind of run off and do my thing, right, and let me see the impact of pride and self reliance and all that. So this business right away, like right when we started, we planned it well. We had a nice network to sell to, and we just went out and sold. And the business did really well, like right out of the gate. Like a year and a half into it, we were doing, you know, four or $500,000 a month in revenue, which for an early stage startup is a big deal, especially a tech startup. Right? We had 20,000 customers. We were rocking. Um, and so it was all about us. It was all about my ability and my mentor's ability and the sales team we had built and all this stuff. And so the pride and ego starts to kick in and the self reliance, very little dependence on God. Even though I'd still go to church on Sunday, I was completely disconnected from my faith and my business, right? And looking back, God does allow that in a season. He allows us to kind of go do our thing. But in his love for us, he's like, okay, that's enough. So on the tail end of it, on the other side of it, it started to lead to like infighting between the partnership and a lot of frustration. And even though the business was doing well, no one was enjoying coming to work. And so that started to erode. And eventually, about 2.5 years in, everyone just kind of went their separate ways. We kind of broke the business up. This group took this part, this group took this part. And all that pride of like, oh, look how awesome we are came crashing down, right? Because like now
Mm,
we had nothing to show for it, so to speak. And that was just the Lord's hand in saying, okay, that's not how you build. You don't build a business separate from me. You don't just show up to church and do your thing and then go on Monday to run a business. It's all connected, and that's when it kind of all came together. In as the second business kind of, I don't say fell apart, but just kind of wound down. And the next 7 years of my life, which was business number three, was when I was learning these lessons of pride because I fought it, right. I was like, how could you let this happen, God? Like we were doing so well, and so you got to go through
right.
all that shaking your fist stuff and then come to the other side of it.
Yeah, I'd like to probe a little bit more and rest on the theme of what you mentioned it like you weren't necessarily submitted to God, like you went to church and God's like, wait a second, like this is not what a submitted Christian life is. Like it's more than that. It's what this Pastor Douglas Wilson says, all of Christ for all of life sort of mentality. So let's kind of keep that theme in the back of our minds. But so essentially this business did really well until it didn't. And
Yeah.
it didn't the didn't part was more the relationship side of it. It wasn't necessarily the financial side of it.
Well, relationship stuff leads to financial stuff, right? It leads to like who's got control of the money and who's getting paid how much. And like, so
Oh,
that led to
okay.
financial distrust, which led to the separation of everything. But really, all that was God basically taking his hand of favor off. And it happened so fast that our success wasn't of us. We thought it was of us, but it was clearly not of us. But the drop And the lack of success was clearly not of us either, because the market was booming. There were customers like crazy, but everything just started to slow down. So it was like you could just tell God's taking his hand of faith off.
Okay. And then
Yeah.
right before we move on to business number three, what were like some of the practical lessons that you learned in this season?
Yeah, so in that business, the big things I learned was people. So for the first business, it was all about my individual skill, like learning how to sell, learning how to negotiate. And the second one, because we ended up with a pretty decent sized team, it was all about, everything from hiring and onboarding and all those mistakes to not firing correctly, to firing too late, to dealing with people, mentoring, coaching, advising, all the people stuff of the business. I learned a lot in that journey. And fortunately, I was still in church. So like there were some seeds of kind of biblical truths that were starting to seep in, even though I wasn't consciously applying it. But by the grace of God, it was still happening to some extent.
Very interesting. So
Yeah.
we've looked at the two businesses so far. You learned how to talk to people, right? That was skill number one, and then essentially skill
Yeah.
number two was uh,
To work
understanding
with
the
people.
relationships between people.
Yeah, that's right. Because even when things were falling apart amongst the partners and deals were being negotiated to exit and all that, you still learn a lot about people, right? And greed and hey, you're my best buddy when things are good, but when things aren't so good, how people respond and change. And I learned a lot. You and I have done a session on partnerships, right? We did.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you're like, Joe, man, where are you getting this opinion about partnerships? And most partnerships fail. I'm like, look, in the early days, partners think the world of each other and want to serve each other and do all kinds of great stuff till things get tough, or one partner gets lazy and then everything changes, right? So those are some of those lessons learned there.
Okay, let's jump into business three. And so you're kind of on like a high, and then you kind of declined because there's some relationship problems, and then I'm assuming you got out, and then
And then I, I
What
didn't
happens
want to take
next?
another, yeah, I didn't want to take a job. So I was like, let's start another business. So actually what happened was me, our VP of sales, and a couple key people said, well, if they're going to go do their thing, we'll just start our version of the same company. Like we have our customer relationships, there's plenty of demand. Let's just set up shop and do our own thing. And so we did. So again, all indications would say because we had market intelligence, we had network, we had relationships, we had knowledge, we should have just kept going and being successful. But man, that was the 7 year journey of God, like saying, no, that's not going to happen. Till we fix a few things in you, you aren't going to be successful. Even though my partner was a believer, strong believer, and like he was a fired up Christian, like despite all our skill, it just wouldn't go. Um, and so that was my journey of like first fighting with God, saying, how could you let this happen? To like, okay, what are you trying to do here? To finally, okay, finally, I'll submit and move in a different direction than I have before. My business isn't mine. All these skills and knowledge aren't me. Um, I can build a business for you. And that was the time when I started to understand the intersection between work and faith, and business and faith, and entrepreneurship in the Bible. That was that 7 year journey to discover all that while I could barely pay the bills and while, I was worried about how to stay afloat. It was a wonderful window of time. Another huge learning lesson.
So let's dive into that. So before you were saying that your second business you weren't fully submitted to God, and this business was where you were learning to have a dependence and faithfulness in Him. What were the what were some of the key specific moments and lessons that God allowed you to endure and learn to kind of turn you back to Him?
Well, yeah, if you think of if you think of the children of Israel, right, as they're wandering in the wilderness, one day they're like, "Oh, God is awesome." The next day, like, "Where's our food?" Right. So that was
Yeah.
very much like my journey, which was like because things were sparse and I hadn't experienced this level of like lack of resources. At first, I was doing the shake my fist, why isn't God a provider? God, you promised this. You're like, right, claiming God's promises for what He hasn't done, and then the recognition that wait, that what am I not doing, right? Where's my heart not submitted? Where's my heart kind of haughty and proud and all that? And that journey, I mean, for some people it's overnight, right? You hear like a good sermon, you hear a good teaching, and you're like, okay, that's it, I'm done, I'm turning. It took 4 or 5 years for me to even get to the point of recognizing it, because that's how stubborn I was. But then, yeah, so those were some of the main lessons learned, is how to go from pride to humility in a very long journey.
So I'm assuming you've mentioned in previous episodes you had like a quote unquote like a bloodbath business. Was this the bloodbath? And
Yeah,
if
this I
so,
consider, yeah,
what happened?
yeah. Well, the bloodbath was like, we couldn't sell our way out of a paper bag. Like, we couldn't get a deal to save our lives, even though there were deals to be had, and we were amazing at our previous businesses and selling, because God's hand of favor had been removed. Because God was like, "This is where you're going to learn your lesson. This is going to be a wilderness experience." The bloodbath was financial, like upside down, like overdrawn bank accounts, this, that, the other, like stress all the time. Um, yeah, that was it.
So
While, by the way, new married, young kids in the house, right? You got all those expenses, and you're hustling, hustling, hustling. Going, yeah, maybe in 2 days we'll be able to make that purchase. Maybe in 3 days we'll be able to buy some groceries. That whole thing, it's fine if it lasts a month or two or six, but when it lasts years, it's a bloodbath.
yeah, so essentially that was a trying time in your life, and then you slowly were coming back to being more submitted to the Lord. At what moment did you decide to get out of that and start that fourth business? What was like the final kibosh on it?
It wasn't so much a kibosh; it was more a gift. Um, so, I wrote the book Entrepreneurial DNA, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that whole thing, that whole methodology, the whole bossy assessment of entrepreneurial behavior, it was just a one-time thing that popped in my head one morning when I was just writing and journaling, like in my frustrations. Um, so that was kind of like God saying, "Okay, I've got you to where I need you to. Here you go." And in about 20 minutes, the entire methodology that's in that book that's now gone global was right there on a piece of paper. I still have the original piece of paper I was scribbling on, right? I framed it because that was so suddenly in a moment, um, a brand new business kind of birthed itself. Oh, I got to write about this. I got to get this out to my friends and see what they think about it. And as soon as I started to share with my entrepreneurial network, they were like, "Joe, this is amazing. I've never heard this stuff before. It's intuitive, but man, like, you should write about this." And that just took off into a venture of its own. So one thing kind of, I was just like, I don't even care about that other one anymore. It was such a pain. So let's go and head forth.
Yeah, and for our listeners, you're referring to Bossy, correct? And we've done an
Yeah, yeah,
episode on that. What
that's
was
right.
one of our first episodes actually,
Yeah, season
where we
one.
were trying to figure out what kind of entrepreneurs each of us were. And Joe, you're
Yeah,
you're a
yeah,
builder, I imagine, correct? A
yeah. I'm like
builder,
I'm more a secondary builder. I'm more like an IB, innovator builder. Yeah,
innovator builder.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm still, I think I'm still in the process of figuring out which one I am, but
Oh,
we'll
I
see,
know
we'll
what you
see.
are. Keep going.
Anyways, so yeah, if you guys want to check that out, I'll link that episode as a suggested video, or put that in the description as well. And then Entrepreneurial DNA, yeah, Joe's book. Joe, you've also been on a couple TEDx talks, which have been pretty cool.
Yeah,
So
that all came out of
that
that
was all at
body
the
of
same
work. Yeah.
time. And
Hmm.
so you're scribbling, and you realize you kind of stumbled upon, or God gave you this realization of, oh, this might actually be something that can be another business that provides value, immense value to
Hmm.
entrepreneurs. So what was that next step, going from, okay, I think I need to transition out of this really stressful, not successful business, and move into this and take this idea and monetize it essentially.
Yeah, it was very organic, right? At that point, okay, I got something. I want to share it with the world. How do I do it, right? So, and when it's something like intellectual property, it made sense to write about it. So, blog about it, write articles about it, and more people were giving feedback, going, "Look, this should be a book. This should be a book." I'm like, "What do you mean it should be a book? I don't read a lot of books, let alone write a book." But again, God's grace, just took a 90-day window, started writing about it, recorded myself talking about it, transcribed it, and sure enough, there was enough there to be a book. And then the big breakthrough was when McGraw Hill said they'd publish it, right? We put it
Wow.
out to a lot of publishers. And when McGraw-Hill picked it up, it was like, okay, this is not of me. I had no relationships, no network. They usually want you to be a proven author with millions of followers before they'll even publish your book. All those doors got opened. And then, so when the book got published and the TED Talks happened, then a lot of consulting opportunities came. As people are reading the book, they're like, hey, can we hire you to come help us with this stuff? Which then led to the consulting firm. And then the consulting firm led to people saying, can you just run my business for me? Like, I'm tired. I don't want to run my business. Like, I'll just give you equity, just build it. And so I brought my partner, Charlie, in, gave him half the company because he had a skill set I didn't have. And man, yeah, one day we looked up and we had $100 million worth of businesses we were operating
Wow.
out of an office in Chicago. We all over the world. We had companies, because people would read the book and just fall in love with the concept and say, I want to run my business this way. And they would just, in a sense, hand the keys over. Yeah, so it was a huge transition from, I don't know how I'm going to make the grocery bill in 4 days to that.
So when you were going about starting this business based off of Bozzy and the entrepreneurial DNA, how did your lessons or what you learned from your previous business in regards to like submission to the Lord, what were the was it like day and night? Like what were the differences in how you approached um, serving the Lord in through your business?
Yeah, a big part of it was submission, right? Like first of all, when I brought my partner Charlie in, I made him the CEO. I was like second in command. I was like the innovation guy. He was the CEO. So just that, to go from the guy who thinks he knows it all and controls it all and is super smart and can do it all, to be able to then say, no, Charlie, you're way smarter than me. You have way more skill than me. You run it. I'll do whatever you say. Uh, it was I was just a different human by then, right? I was just thinking differently, operating differently. I was like, I don't need to control everything. I don't want to be the boss of it all. So that was one area, just submitting to a human in business. He was a believer, so which is much easier to do. But then in just dealing with people, right? In deal making, like in the early days, it was hustle, hustle, get the best deal you can. Here it became, as you start reading the Proverbs and learning about the even balances and even scales, and it's like, no, like there is such thing as win-win. And in some cases, it's okay for me to lose for someone else to win because that would glorify God. And like someone's like, you underpaid me by $20. Like, dude, here's $50. Like, here's $100. Like, we don't want to even be in a situation where someone can say, we took advantage of them, right? And I've carried that forward now. Like I think I mentioned to you, I've been in a partnership where we were trying to buy someone out, and they thought they were worth 2 times more. We're like, dude, take 4 times more. Like this is not my money anymore, so I don't care. So those are complete 180s from the person I was in business number one, two, and three.
Yeah, I think you just said something that really you said it's not my money anymore, which I think is a really, it's a pretty crazy thing to say in our cultural context where as an entrepreneur it's you want to take ownership of your money and all that you earn is your hard work, etc. So I think that's something, I think we're going to do a part 2 to this episode. We might be able to dive into the concept of stewardship a little bit more, but before we wrap up, I want to hear the rest of your story up until now. So entrepreneurial DNA, Bozzy, is this a business that is continuing on to this day?
Actually, that business got absorbed into the company that I'm a partner in
Okay.
now because my partner Charlie, you know how we were running a bunch of companies? So one of those companies was this massive manufacturing company, and they're like, Charlie, can you just come be our CEO? And Charlie's like, Joe, I should really go do this. They need me. I was like, yeah, totally makes sense. Let's bless them by you just taking over there. So we sold off all the other stuff, and then I just took all the bossy stuff and plugged it into the company that I'm a partner in now. So right now, the company I'm in, it's a consulting firm. We also have a technology company and a creative agency. So it's three businesses all kind of aligned to each other, and I run them all for my partner. And I've got a visionary partner who's like this incredible mind, who's a creative, and I'm kind of the operational side of our business.
Yeah, would you mind sharing the name of the company which you guys
Yeah,
do
so
right
the
now?
company, the first company that was the consulting firm is called Beyond Academics. We serve the higher education space, so all the major colleges and universities are our clients. And then IntelliCampus is our technology arm, where we're building some really cool technology for universities and institutions. And then Hero Creative Agency is the agency where we've got really bright artists and graphic designers and videographers, and we produce great content for those for the colleges we're involved in. So yeah, it's a three-pronged business that operates as one.
That's really neat. I love the concept of improving education and innovation in
It's a long
education
way
because
to
I think
go.
there's
Yeah, it's a
yeah, I
long
think
way
there
to
really
go.
is a long way to go. So that's really cool, and
Yeah.
I will be sure to keep up on that. Um, what were the lessons in this last business? What are some of the practical and maybe some spiritual lessons that you've learned in your journey? Because now,
I think the power of humility, that's the big one, right? I think being humble, not to my partner, because like when you're in a business partnership, you're going to agree a lot of times, but a lot of times you may not agree, right? But how much of a disagreement do you show? Do you just go, you know what? No, I'm just going to submit that to the Lord. I'm not going to get wound up about this silly thing where I may not see it the way he sees it, but what if I submit right now and just say, yeah, you're right. It's not going to harm your decision isn't going to harm us. It's just a difference of how you like green, I like pink. Fine, let's go with pink, right? Those kinds of things, learning, submitting to that, and then serving our staff, right? Like it's one thing to be a boss. We just went with a flat organization. Nobody reports to anybody, and it's just we're here to make sure you guys are successful. That's kind of the mindset, and I found that builds great culture. We have an amazing culture, and it's just because we want to serve our people rather than have them serve us. Those are all lessons learned right out of the Bible, right? And watching Jesus operate and how he worked with his disciples and how he washed their feet. So, like, how can I even be 5% of that? Um, and so, applying some of those biblical truths in has been a really cool thing. And then, of course, when resources come in, right? How do we steward those well? God puts the right church or the right ministry in our path, and we can give them a few bucks or whatever we can do. That's the easy stuff. The hard stuff is the people stuff, and being a different person than your flesh calls you to be.
well, Joe, thank you so much for sharing your journey as a serial entrepreneur who has obviously a faith journey in there as well. And we at Kingdom Commerce, we want to equip all of you watching with the practices and principles to glorify God and succeed in the marketplace. And sometimes stories are a great way to show how God has worked through people's lives, not only to refine them and sanctify them, but also how He has blessed and taught His people through things like business and entrepreneurship. And so, as we close out this episode, I just want to encourage all our listeners to have godly ambition, to be righteous, and to go build and create things. Thanks, Joe, for being on, and we'll catch you all for part 2.